ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. Namaste to all. Today we are having a lecture on Dharmpal's The Beautiful Tree Indigenous Indian Education System by Sri M.S. Chaitra, a well-known ecologist. Today I welcome Sri M.S. Chaitra for this program.
Thank you, Prasanna and Jaisima.
Today, the Mythic Society, I think it is the 9th online lecture we are conducting due to this COVID-19 pandemic. And Sri M.S. Chaitra is an ecologist currently working as director and fellow of Arohi Research Development Foundation. Current research programs involve addressing issues related to development studies, politics of development, environment conflict, post-development alternatives. He has worked with many universities like University of Mysore, Utkal University, Tumkur University, Wildlife Institute of India, CCMB Hyderabad, and Center for Ecological Sciences at IISc Bangalore. Other than the core areas mentioned, he has also contributed to education policy and governance as the director of CES, Center for Educational and Social Studies. He has completed his MSc in zoology from University of Mysore, and his PhD is to be awarded in the subject zoology from Utkal University, Bhubaneswar. He has published many books and attended and submitted and presented papers in nearly 100 conferences, national and international conferences. He has organized more than 10 international workshops and participated in more than 15 conferences as an organizer. He has given more than 30 invited lectures and guided undergraduate and master and MPhil level students. Regularly, he writes articles both in Kannada and English on issues of culture, development, and science. A regular TV panelist on various Kannada TV channels for debates related to science, environment, and development. Today, we are happy to invite Sri M.S. Chaitra for this program. I request M.S. Chaitra to start the lecture on this on behalf of the Mythic Society and all the participants in the program. Sir, welcome to you, and floor is left to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prasanna. So the introduction that you have heard about me is my past life. In last close to a decade, I am a social scientist. I am trying to build a group of people who are doing serious research in social sciences. I work with Professor S.N. Balagangadhara, who is located at Ghent University in Belgium. He is my mentor. And we have a team, and these are the two institutions with which I currently work. Okay, and we have series of students who are working on Indian culture. And the story of the talk that we have today gives you a kind of an understanding. Also, partly why actually, I was interested in social sciences and how do we talk about Indian society, our own culture, etc. So today we will focus on one particular theme, that is education. What kind of education system existed in India in the 19th century when colonialism was taking its root. And let's try to understand what is that we talk about ourselves today. And let's also try to go and figure out how did British, when they were ruling us, saw this education system, when they were trying to conquer India and then trying to establish the rule. So the story that I will be focusing today is in the early to mid part of the 19th century, between 1820s to 1860s of India. That was the time there was a lot of interesting things that British observed about education in India. So, and I will come to that when I start talking about Dharampal. Before that, let's go and try to sort of sketch the background within which we should try to look at this talk. Sorry, 1 minute. Yeah. See, today, let's just, briefly brush ourselves that what do we talk about education in general and higher education in particular in India. So if you look at newspaper reports to various committee reports, starting from Radhakrishnan Committee, Kothari Committee report, to most recent National Education Policy, everywhere, one of the common thing that you recognize that our education system is in crisis. Though it is unclear what exactly is the nature of the crisis. Different people, keep pointing to different kinds of problems, but nonetheless, everyone agrees that there is a crisis of education in India. And when they talk about this crisis, there are also a large number of issues, that gets discussed around it. Now, some of the most common themes that you look at it, there is this lack of quality in education that is that is given in India. See, people say that the Indian, for example, Indian education engineers are not alone unemployed, but they are unemployable. This speaks volumes about the kind of quality that we have in terms of education system. Now, there is also claim that Indian education is not, say, inclusive, in the sense it doesn't give access to all kind of education to everybody. There is also question of affordability, whether people can afford certain kind of education, people can afford certain kind of institutions where they wanted to go and learn. So there is this extraordinary crisis that people talk about, both in terms of access and whether we can afford, such an education that is available today. There is also fingers that are pointed out today about privatization of education. Many would believe that that is a threat. And there is also an extraordinary discussion in last three decades that we know is about the commercialization of education. And you are all familiar with the pros and cons of Right to Education Act that came into being. And then there is this, sort of unending, never-ending discussion about rural-urban divide, which also gets coupled with the English language, English medium schools versus mother tongue education. And now there is another new level that these debates have taken in terms of talking about crisis. Some would argue that you need to introduce liberal education. Some would want to focus on STEM. There are many different kinds of debates, but these are the broad categories and they're relevant to the kind of talk that the kind of discussion that we are going to take today. Now, if you look at this discussion and look at how people looked at, our education system is continuation of what was introduced during the British period. Be it our schooling system, be it our boards, be it our education administrative machinery, be it our university, all these things are modeled with what British has introduced during their rule. Now, therefore, many would argue that British were very important in bringing education to India. And they, in fact, a large number of people would believe that British introduced a just system, a fair system of education, without which Indian education was not fair at all. But for British, people argue that many would have suffered, many would have been controlled, subjugated, oppressed, etc. So therefore, even there are some groups which would even go and say that colonialism ended the historical injustice. Therefore, the English education is emancipatory. Because of English education, a large number of community, a large number of people have been liberated. These are the claims, which are very common. You pick up Indian Express or Hindu or any magazine, any discussion, whether it is in the local language or it is in English language. I mean, this is the standard story that one would encounter. Now, if you look at some of the kind of comment, so I'm sure it is visible to all of you. In fact, people would say during the colonialism and education, during colonial period, how education was there. The British had introduced a state-run egalitarian system of elementary education with the regional language as the medium of instruction and English as a subject from the 6th standard onward. But the system came to be monopolized by the upper caste. It was only thanks to English medium schools run by the Christian missionaries and British Army that outcasts such as Ambedkar could get a proper education. So one of the claims is that it would not have been possible for certain sections of the society without the British Christian missionary intervention and British Army's intervention. They would have been in deep misery because there was no access to education. Now, the Macaulay system of education, many believes, that at least freed education from the grip of the upper caste Gurukula. So there is this claim that there are particular kind of Gurukula, and they were controlled by upper caste, and precisely because of this upper caste Gurukula, many people were denied to have an opportunity to have education. Now, I don't need to go on elaborating on this. I mean, most of you are familiar with some of this discussion. Now, let's come back. Now, how Gandhiji looked at it. So, Mahatma Gandhi, see, if you look at one of the roundtable conferences where he was giving the talk in London, he says, I say, without fear of my figures being challenged successfully, that today India is more illiterate than it was 50 or 100 years ago. And so is Burma, because the British administrators, when they came to India, instead of taking hold of things as they were, began to root them out. The scratched soil and began to look at the root and left the root like that, and the beautiful tree perished. So one of the claims that Gandhi made in the Roundtable Conference in London, after the Roundtable Conference, in one of the talks, that he said, see, there was a beautiful tree in India prior to British control over education system in India. Now that beautiful tree nurtured everybody. Now he goes on at length. Okay. Now there were also, kind of response to it. Before going it, let's read out some more claims by Gandhi. The village schools were not good enough for the British administrator. So he came out with his program. Every school must have so much of paraphernalia, buildings and so forth. There are statistics left by British administrator which shows that in places where they have carried out survey, ancient schools have gone by the board because there was no recognition of these schools. Now, when Gandhi goes on even to further, he in fact sees that if there were no state-controlled boards, Indian education would flourish. Anyway, he has his own reasons to argue that. I mean, that's not the central point of the claim. But one of the important points of the claim is that they changed the outlook of the education. They fundamentally changed the way the learning processes in India existed in every corner of the country. This was the claim by Gandhi. And the schools established after the European pattern were too expensive for the people. I defy anybody to fulfill a program of compulsory primary education of this mass inside of a century. This very poor country of mine is ill able to sustain such an expensive method of education. Our state would revive the old schoolmaster and dot every village with a school both for boys and girls. But what we know today, this is what Gandhi said in 1930s. Certainly the compulsory primary education of these masses had not been successfully achieved inside of a century, following the British state education model as predicted by Gandhi. Gandhi was absolutely right in saying this method of education will not be able to give access of education to every single individual in the country, both boys and girls, and ill able to sustain the expensive method of education that were being championed by the development experts, whether because of the lack of funds, corruption, or mixture of both. So you could not sustain it because of many reasons. But whatever be the case, Gandhi was absolutely right in his understanding of what is going to happen to Indian education if the European mode of education is pursued very seriously. And it did happen. Even today, for example, have we achieved 90% literacy rate with the kind of quality that Gandhi was talking about? If you ask that question, absolutely not. So the question remains, what was Gandhi saying and what were the responses towards it? That sets some kind of a background to the work of Dharampal, one particular work of Dharampal. Now, so the story of the beautiful tree begins with this claim, the metaphor used by Gandhi to talk about Indian education as a beautiful tree. And this claim began in England, and there was a man in the talk. His name was Sir Philip Horton, and he was one of the founder of the School of Oriental Studies in the University of London today. It is one of the prestigious schools today, And he was also the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Dhaka. So therefore, he had first-hand experience of living in India. He questioned Gandhi at the meeting itself and, unsatisfied by his answers, entered into a long correspondence with him, culminating in hour-long interview. Now, unconvinced, Hartog repeatedly insisted that Gandhi publicly revoke his comment. Because there is some bit of story that I must tell you now. The story is that Hartog continues to keep asking questions to Gandhi, and Gandhi becomes busy, and he did not have the data and the reports in his hand. He could not write. So Hartog comes to India and makes an interview of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi could not satisfactorily answer him with all the data, etc. Therefore, Hartog, after a few years, comes back and he writes a book, which is a rebuttal to claim of Gandhi in 1930s. That is, the book is published as some aspects of Indian education, past, present. So this was published. It is still available in the archives. One could go and look at it. So he does a scathingly critical review of Gandhi. In fact, he goes to an extent of saying that Gandhi is simply making a claim which is untrue. Now, Hartog disagrees about both quality of indigenous educational provisions before the British and its quality. Now, because when Gandhi said that it is given to everybody, every corner of India was more literate than what it was there in 1930s, Hartog simply disagrees. Neither the numbers nor the kind of quality that is being given today was even dreamt of in India. That is what his claim. Hartog did not appear to dispute that there had been spontaneous mushrooming of private schools in India before the British got involved. He concurred that English teaching schools sprang up all over Bengal, prompted in part by ordinary people's desire to learn English and hence enter British service. Moreover, he conceded that these schools had nothing to do with the British. The movement received little encouragement or stimulus from the government. For at the time, there was no deep-seated desire of Great Britain to westernize Indian education. No, instead, the growth of schools was spontaneous and voluntary. These are the claims by Hartog. Okay, but whatever this agreement, he believed that the commentators, including Munro, exaggerated the extent of educational entrepreneurship in 19th century India. In his lectures, Hartog was curt and dismissive about the evidences. I have grave doubts as to the accuracy of these figures, but that's all he said to his audience about Munro and his detailed survey. Now, why it is important? Now, when Dharampal came to the scene to think about education, to think about how British looked at our systems, what was there, etc. Now, this discussion served as a background. So, either Dharampal being an ardent Gandhian, he had to either agree that whatever Hartog has said is true, or he has to prove Gandhi was right. Now, he wanted to really know. So now comes this man Dharampal. He was born in 1922 and he was a Gandhian thinker. He left BSc in his halfway to attend Quit India movement, married a British woman, and he kept on traveling between India and London. And he, after marriage, after India got independence, he went to London. He tried picking up some job and he was not very satisfied with the job. So what he did was he started going to the British Library, and some of these concerns which were really disturbing him about Indian education, Indian science and technology, Indian system, Indian institutions of managing the conflicts, etc., were really bothering him. So he started spending time in British Museum and looking at British documents. So therefore, he explored the British archive for Gandhi's claims about education. That is one component. He has done much more than the education. But his work is enormous. But I am focusing on one particular aspect that he has developed and he has written about. It is about Indian education. He spent his time on understanding British data on India. So, what did Dharampal do in his work? Now, if you look at the Beautiful Tree kind of a book, it's something very peculiar kind of a book that you would see. So you have this book. In one part, you have a very lengthy introduction to the book, why this book is important, what made Dharampal to collect such a data. And then you have the entire book, more than half the book, full of tables. You know, what kind of tables? Now, how many schools were there in India, in different provinces, in different places, in which year, you know, how many girl students were there, how many boys were there in the school, what level of education, primary, secondary, tertiary education, etc. Who were the teacher, to which jati these teachers belonged to, what were the kind of textbook that were used. So what he did was he went on, collected data that was already collected by the British archival data, and he organized them in such a manner that you could go and see it yourself. And there is something very peculiar and interesting about it, in the sense he did not interpret this data in any way. He has said what is the context, what is the point, why, how it appears to him, he said in his introduction. And then you have the tables. Now the task in front of us to think and go back to the question that I raised around the crisis and see whether we can make sense of it in terms of today's conversation that we have about India, and is there anything to learn from our culture, if at all we wanted to go further in the future in the 21st century. So one of the reports that he focuses in the beautiful tree is this Munro's report. So Munro was a British officer. He was the governor of the Madras Presidency. And earlier Madras Presidency consisted of some districts in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, some entire part of Tamil Nadu, some parts of Kerala, and some smaller portions of Karnataka like South Canara, Udupi and other places. Okay. So what Munro wanted to do? So Munro wanted to do something about education in India. Now, when he came to the scene, what was the opinion? Everyone in England seemed to have an opinion about Indian education. So he looks at that opinion, and what does he feel? The ignorance of the people of India and the means of disseminating knowledge among them is something that these officers were given as the task, because there is an extraordinary ignorance. People were superstitious. There are immoral people. They need to be taught. They need to be educated. It was a white man burden. So they wanted to come with that kind of an agenda, but no one had any evidence, and it was idle chatter. That is what Munro says, and he sees that this is based on prejudice. So they are mere conjuncture of individuals unsupported by any authentic documents. So this is what Munro feels about what British thought about it. So therefore Munro wanted to really figure out, is it the case that India, a country like India, is really so pathetic in terms of education? Now he wanted to find out, therefore he proposed to discover the truth by conducting a survey of what was actually happening in the ground. And he could do it because he was the governor in the Madras Presidency. So in Munro's minute, he sent some minute on June 25th, 1822. And it was sent to all district collectors within the Madras Presidency. And the terms of reference themselves are interesting. Now, they will clearly point to an answer that there were schools in the villages before the British intervened. And each collector was asked to submit a list of schools in which reading and writing are taught in each district, showing the number of scholars in each and the caste to which they belong to. And the collector's report, filtered back slowly, several taking a year or more, and one taking 3 years. And it was a very long research process. All but one collector took the job seriously, and the principal collector of Canara compiled that filing in the form would take up considerable time, which would be wasted because everyone knew there are no colleges in Canara, nor fixed schools and masters to teach them. Fortunately, his was the only such report. All other collectors furnished the required information. So of the 20 districts, except for Canara district, in all other districts in the Madras Presidency, the data was collected and sent. Now the data, after Munro's minute, the data are quite remarkable. Far from there being no school in India before the British brought their system, the figures show an abundance of pre-existing schools and colleges. In the 20 district returning data, 11,575 schools and 1,094 colleges were reported with 1,57,195 and 5,431 students respectively. In addition, many collectors reported that considerably more scholars and students were educated in their own homes. Although such numbers were difficult to discern, some estimates were made. For instance, the collector of Madras, who had reported 5,699 scholars in schools and reported that an additional of 26,963 school level scholars were there receiving tuition in their homes. That is 5 times more than they were in schools. Obviously, it's an underestimate nonetheless. That's such an estimate. So what you get officially found in school and who were being educated in school was enormous for the kind of population that existed at that time. This is in 1820s. Munro suggested that such homeschooling would be a common throughout the presidency. Now look at Munro's minute. Munro summarized the evidences in his minute on March 10, 1826. The existing indigenous schools were serving about 25% of the male school age population, he wrote, but given that many more were reportedly being educated in their own homes, he estimated that at least 1/3 of the male population was being schooled. And for girls, the number in schools were much lower, but this could be explained by the fact that they were educated entirely in the home. Now, these are very conservative estimates. The level of education enrollment reported Munro is higher than it was in most European countries at no very distant period. So you must remember this claim. This was claimed by Munro, who was an European, who came from London to India. He found the level of education. He goes on further. Munro's report itself actually elaborates it in very greater detail. That he found it very interesting to note, not just at that point in time when they were conducting survey, even before, say 300, 400 years before, no European nation had such kind of an education system. That numbers, that quality was not there. Moreover, the indigenous schooling system did not just focus on the elite, but included the most disadvantaged and the poorest. What are totally classified as backward caste in India amounted to a substantial minority of the enrollment in each district. For instance, 38% of the school population in Tirunelveli and 32% in Salem, in Madras. I am just giving you the data from a couple of districts. If you pull it, there are places where it goes to 54%, 55%. In the sense, what do we call today as OBC, disadvantaged classes? And if you look at what do you call as Dalits today, for example, Parayas, Irolas, etc., their numbers are startling, and the kind of education that they were available is very interesting. Now, these are the available data. There are much more which is not available anyway. Nonetheless, whatever is available speaks volumes about the kind of education level that was existing. For example, one could ask this question in Tamil Nadu today, that if take for instance Tirunelveli district and the Salem district. If you take that, if in 1820s, 38% of the OBC population were educated, then why it was the case in independent India and during early part of the 20th century, they were very low in terms of their education. Now, one of the arguments most of this OBC group would claim that we got educated precisely because British introduced our education. But the data shows completely opposite of it. In fact, their education level went down precisely because of colonialism, and they were better educated before colonialism. Now, this is what the data that is available through who? Munro's minutes. They collected data for about 3 years, and this is what the data speaks. Now, we can expand now. I just focused on Munro because Munro's report had its own historical significance in terms of it made a lot of noise in the British Parliament. But let's focus on other part. Now, 13 years later, after Munro's report, because this report became a sensational claim. In fact, Munro made a claim that there are more than 1 lakh schools in India, and this was a huge discussion point within the British Parliament. And there was a lot of discussion about it, which led to the nationwide data collection within their colony. Now, so this entire process began in 1838. So let's focus on one report on Bengal Presidency. State of Education in Bengal 1835 to 38, published in 1841 by University of Calcutta. Now, Adams' first report concluded that there were about 1 lakh village schools in Bengal, Bihar in 1830s. This includes Bengal, Orissa, Jharkhand, Bihar. Now, Adam noted that it appears that the system of village schools is extensively prevalent, that the desire to give education to their male children must be deeply seated in the minds of the parents, even of the humblest classes, and that these are the institutions closely interwoven as they were with the habits of the people and the customs of the country. In other words, they are saying educating their children, making them learn things, has become part of their customary practices of their daily life. So therefore, there are an extraordinary hunger. They are deeply seated. This is the word that is used by Adam. He's saying there is this deeply seated, this idea of educating people in the minds of parents, even of the humblest of the classes. So even the most ordinary people, even the most, economically weaker, would want to educate their children. Again, his work revealed an extensive system of indigenous education, responding to the situation and needs of the poor. Okay. Similarly, there was a report around 1820 on the British Bombay Presidency. There is hardly a village, great or small, throughout the territories in which there is not at least one school. In the larger village, is more. And from Punjab, this is called Leitner's report. Leitner conducted a series of surveys in Punjab, which includes the Punjab Pakistan part of Punjab and Sindh and other part. A report documented around 330,000 pupils in the schools of the various denominations who were acquired with reading, writing, and some method of computation. From Madras to Bengal, from Bombay to Punjab, the accumulated evidence showed that any claim of no indigenous schooling worth speaking of before British intervened was completely wrong. In fact, the claim was, everyone is saying that the Indians are in misery, there is no education, nobody knows how to read, so they need to be liberated from their misery of lack of education, etc. That turned out to be bogus, and it looks like almost they could not find a single village which did not have a school. On the contrary, it all pointed to a vibrant indigenous system serving at least as high a portion of boys as in European countries, including England, just a few years earlier. In fact, what England wanted to achieve is something, that India had already achieved much before the British came here. Now, so it raises any number of questions. For example, before getting into the details of its relevance today, one other question that many people have actually responded to this data he summarized. Today, now we have access to all these reports, Adams' report, Leitner's report, the report which came from Bengal Presidency, the report, that came from, Madras Presidency, and there are subsequent reports. For example, if you look at once they have established the, Public Education Council, so you find all the reports available today, and if you put them together, there are many interesting things that are available. Now, interestingly, there was no centralized board, and there was no centralized system of fixing what should be the curriculum and what should be the syllabus and what should be the nature of evaluation. I mean, it was completely not there. And every time the schools were revolving around a teacher. So, in fact, there were families which are recognized as families of teachers. Now, contrary to the understanding, teachers actually were not from Brahmin families, because people thought it's only Brahmins who came and taught everywhere. you could realize, if you go to the details of the work that is available in the Dharmpal's book, you would see that people across various jati came. There are places where every jati had their own school in each village. And there are places where there used to be one school where people of multiple jatis used to come and they used to teach. Okay. Now, there are all kinds of combination and there are all kinds of level. So one of the difficulty, for example, Munro and others keep pointing out, how do you locate these schools? One of the biggest of the problem that they had is to identify where are the schools. So for them, the idea of school was always located around a state sanctioned, a government sanctioned building around which, there are government appointed teacher who gets funded by the government. But that does not seem to be the case, in the kind of material that we have allowed. Now, for example, look at the question, financing and access. Now, how the system of education that in the 19th century period, when all these states were surveyed, how they were financed and what kind of access people had. Now, so Munro actually specifically asked this question. Now, of the one collector of the Canara who did not want to send the report, of the other 19 districts that are available, of the remaining 90 collector report, I could see that 16 described the system of schooling as 100% privately funded, whereas remaining 3 reported predominantly private and only a tiny proportion, from 1 to 2% of the school in each, funded by the government. Now, what funding? Funding does not necessarily mean giving salary. It is giving some kind of endowment, some land or some temple revenue, etc., that has been allocated from the government. Otherwise, it is predominantly private. Now, you must realize today, see, there is a complaint, there are people who criticize private education in India. Now, this idea of being private, is so fundamentally, Indians are used to it because they wanted to get what kind of education they wanted. And they wanted to choose. This is precisely the kind of education that I wanted. So therefore, they went on looking out and they created their own system. Second, see, the many people today crib about the private tuitions. Now, one of the important aspects, if you look at this report, you would realize that this is precisely what Indians were very comfortable. They wanted to pick up the right kind of a teacher to teach their children for whatever could be their goal. So therefore, this locating the education system around the teacher and it being funded by the people or group of people has been one of the characteristic features that you would see all across Madras Presidency to Bengal to central provinces to Bombay to Punjab, everywhere you would see the same kind of pattern. The collector from the North Arcot district, Mr. William Cook, one of the 3 that reported a small amount of non-private funding, even tell us that cooks pay at one school and the daily allowances for the boilers. Now, you get the feeling that he took this assignment very seriously indeed. Yeah, because he is going into the details of what is the money that is paid and how much it is useful. Anyway, Cook recorded 583 private primary schools teaching in the local languages. Of this, 3 charged no fees, while the remaining 580 charged monthly fees ranging from 15 Anna to 21 rupees per year. And there were also 40 Persian schools, 31 of which were private fee paying school with 308 pupils, supported entirely by the fees ranging from 1 rupee to 14 annas to 24 rupee per year. 7 of the Persian schools were public schools funded either by the village or with the yearly government allowance, where the remaining 2 Persian schools provided free tuition. Finally, there were 7 English private schools, 3 of which were free of charge, while 4 charged fees from 7.5 to 42 rupees per year. Okay, now you will also go further and notice where did this money, etc., the private fees that they were paying came from. In Madras Presidency, the extensive system of schools was more or less entirely privately funded. The same conclusion also stands for Adams' evidence in the Bengal Presidency. Before the British took over and imposed their alien centralized public education system, India had extensive system of private schools that catered to the masses. Before the British came, the Indians already had a system of private schools. including the schools for the poor. More importantly, it was managed by the public and private, but government had very little role to play except for providing some kind of endowment. There are examples where, for example, a village elder supporting somebody else, etc. So therefore nobody was left out in terms of whomever wanted to study and learn was supported. So you will get some more details about it. The collectors also told us something about different motivations of those who set up private schools. One observed that the private schools are partly established occasionally by individuals for the education of their own children, and partly by the teachers themselves for their own maintenance. Some parents, one report says, who are anxious to have their children educated cannot sufficiently pay the teachers out their own money, in which case they procure some other children in addition to their own for being educated and get adequate allowances to them by way of subscription from these children, from 1 quarter to 1 rupee each month. So when they could not, create a school, they could not afford a school for their own children, what they did was they actually managed to pull in some more children, shared the money and gave the allowances to the teacher. The collectors also gave details of how the system accommodated the ability of parents to pay. For instance, one noted that the school fee was paid according to the circumstances of the parent, because in some years they could not get the crops and some years they got excessive crops. Now, depending upon what they got, they compensated it. Another observed that the school masters received monthly from each scholar from 1 quarter to 4 rupees according to their respective needs. Again, the flexibility in payment mirrored what I found in today's private schools for the poor. Now, moreover, the collectors were clear. The schooling system had always been privately funded. British did not come to India and supplant any effective state system of revenue collection that could have funded schooling. Most of the collectors provided information on whether the funding had changed over the years. They reported from detailed investigation that there were no records, verbal or written, of there having been any public funding in the past, meaning government funding. A typical comment came from South Arcot, where the collector argued no allowances of any sort has ever been granted by the native governments to school, the masters of which are entirely supported by the parents of the schools. The conclusion is clear. The deep-rooted and the extensive education system catering to all sections of society, uncovered by Munro's careful survey of the Madras Presidency of 1822, was the private education system. And that was the education system that was existing in India. When the Board of Revenue to the Chief Secretary, the government summarized all the evidences collected on February 21st, 1825 to be given to the governor, Munro, the secretary, agreed with the conclusion. It will be observed that the schools now existing in the country are, for the most part, supported by the payments of the people who sent their children to them for instruction. The rate of payment for each scholar varies in different districts and according to different circumstances of the parents of the pupils. Now we can go on. This is about the finance. One could talk about access in terms of what kind of people, economically disadvantageous people to different jatis. Now you could actually keep creating a laundry list of issues that today we talk as something that the Brahminical conspiracy denied education. In fact, the evidences of the as early as 19th century shows contrary evidence to that. In fact, it was not the state duty. See, for example, it was very smart method of devising such an education system in India. For example, look, see, there is a corona crisis today, and the economy all over the world has gone to the toss. Now, which is the first sector which is going to be hit, It will be education. You wanted to do budgetary cut. Where do you cut? You cut on schools, you cut on research in education, you cut on fees, everything. So education is the first sector when economy is under shaking. So the education suffers a lot today if the education system depends on the government. Now, Indians had an extraordinary system which is not dependent on the government. And it also had developed mechanism in various means to support people who could not afford. So therefore, even say for example, Madras Presidency, one would be started to see the numbers. For example, in Madras Presidency, it is reported that almost 45% of the Muslim women in 1820s were educated. And the least educated women were Brahmin women. So these kind of data are quite startling if you actually carefully observe and think about it. Now, so one could go on about the caste-wise distribution and education, religion-wise distribution and education, geographical area-wise distribution. You can compare Ballari and Mangalore, gender and education, the kind of textbook, what is being taught, who are being taught, medium of instruction, what kind of things they were taught, whether they were teaching Sanskrit, whether they were teaching mother tongue, what is the debate. Today we endlessly debate about medium of instruction, but what were they doing it? How did they manage multilingual situation? And what kind of subjects were taught? And who are the learners? And what levels to which they could be taught? I mean, for all these kind of questions, 19th century surveys done by British offers extraordinary insights. I think they're so exhaustive and interesting that we must think about. Now, one must remember that we as Indians today, after colonialism, we have developed such a kind of memory loss about our own self. For example, in my childhood, in my village, there used to be a system called Kuli Mata. And all of us, we used to go there. And it's only last 4 years back I discovered that Kuli Mata is the kind of indigenous system of education that existed in Karnataka. And I discovered it as that kind of an indigenous education system because the Department of Public Instruction in 1860s had an issue with Kuli Matas because students used to go there in Mysore state. And they wanted to actually bring in reform, etc., etc. That's a different story for some day. So these institutions survived till 1990s. I mean, I remember being part of such institution. And in fact, we used to have families in our village who, say for example, in my village, we used to have this Odin Doddain family. In fact, those were the people who are, reading Doddai's family. In fact, what they were doing, they used to teach children a bit of mathematics, a bit of Sanskrita, the Amarkosha, all Jati people used to learn in our places. So you also see in our epigraphic records, etc., but also in our literature, in Karnataka, for instance, people who are capable of reading. Odina Giriyamma, Odina Tirumalamba, these are the kind of names that you would see. It tells us more. And we have an absolute memory loss about these things. But what kind of education was there? How did it grow, etc.? We have completely forgotten about it. Now, let's come back to some of this. Critics of Indian education brought together some odd bedfellows. Hartag's criticism of the low-quality indigenous schools fit in with the prevalent set of criticism about the low quality of Indian society and culture in general. William Wilberforce reported that Indians were deeply sunk by the religious superstitions, fast-bound in the lowest depths of the moral and social wretchedness. In other words, it's saying Asians are corrupt, Asians are immoral. The stories was also proven through the kind of students that they saw. Marx and Mills carried the same view. And today, what we see in India the criticism also believe in the same story. Now, when I say this, I am making it with a little bit of responsibility. For example, if you look at national curriculum frame, if you look at general talk, for example, one of the complaints that people would talk about is Indian students learn by rote learning. So therefore, what you should do, you should actually push them towards concept learning, which is absent in India. Is that the case? What do you mean by rote learning? What is the issue with rote learning? What is the deficiency of the rote learning? And nobody denies to have concept learning. Does that mean that Indians never had concept learning? What kind of learning abilities Indians have? We have not thought about it. So the opening line of the NC of 2005 says, rote learning has to be eliminated. Eliminate and do what? Now, for example, you're teaching geography, you're teaching mathematics, elementary mathematics. If you don't follow rote learning, what else you would do? Now, one has to think about some of these questions very critically and seriously. And interestingly, these were the criticisms that British developed in the early part of the 20th century. And even today, we carry the same story. Now, for example, one of the complaints that consistently comes, students have no interest. Now, this is exactly the comment British have taught us. Now, we have never asked the question, what would we do to make sure the students will get interest? Now, education has been denied to certain sections. Yes, 20th century, you would see it very clearly, but 19th century data says something else. So the question, who is responsible for denying education to certain section? Is it colonialism or Indian society? So one has to obviously say, contrary to the existing belief, it is colonialism which created the problem. Only colonialism was emancipatory. This is what many Ambedkarites and many Dalit thinkers in India would argue. Now, is it really the case? It's very difficult to argue that. The claims seem to be completely opposite if you take Dharampal and the kind of British reports that are available. It is the European society that is repeated today even in our education circles as scientific truths. And decolonizing these kind of claims which were generated by the British when they looked at Indian society is the process that has to begin today. In fact, some of my friends asked me, yeah, you have been telling Dharampal story all the time. Yeah, do we stop at Dharampal and should we go further? You see, one of my puzzlement with them is nobody has taken this story seriously. If you would have taken the claims of the British documents and what Dharampal was thinking about Indian society, you would probably have looked at Indian today. Contemporary discourse would have been very different. Contemporary stories about India, education, about the population of the students and their desire, etc., that we talk about today should have been very different. So one of the problems is that we have not taken this kind of valuable gems that are available to us very seriously. Therefore, we suffer with an extraordinary amnesia. We have some kind of a memory loss about our own culture. Now, why this memory loss issue is important? It's important because now, if you don't take these things seriously, how do we devise an education policy? How do we think of the future education in India far more seriously? See, this is not a claim. Dharampal's claim is not anti-British, anti-Europe. He was trying to show what fits, what is more useful in terms of educating people in India. And how do we take what suits to this culture and build on it further? For that, he sort of made this painstaking effort, despite he not being a historian. His work is at par with any historian that we know. In fact, we don't have historians of his level today. So given the situation, I think it's a time where we must and start engaging back, and 2022 is his birth centenary. And one of the greatest way of remembering Dharampal would be to go back to his work and make sense of it, use it to think about our society today. And the data that he generated is extraordinarily useful to think about today. I am happy to say, from one of the government of Karnataka's initiative, Kuvempu Bhasha Bharati, we are bringing the complete works of Dharampal in next 1 year in Kannada translation. And I hope other people also take it and start reading it, developing ideas around, start reflecting about it. That is not just the claim about indigenous education, it's about our culture. It's about what suits to our culture. How we understand education today, how do we think about ourselves, therefore take Dharampal seriously today. We can go further with Dharampal and others. With that note, I think I have taken sufficiently long time to talk about the education here. I will stop here. If there are